Welcome to today's deep dive, and may God richly bless your day and your entire week.
Absolutely.
Today, we are opening up something that I think most readers just sort of treat as a historical speed bump.
Yeah, speed bump right between the story of the flood and the life of Abraham.
Exactly. But we're pulling from the extensive study notes and those incredibly detailed ancient maps found in the Holman and the NAA Study Bibles.
Right.
And we are focusing our lens specifically on Genesis chapter 10.
Which is widely known as the Table of Nations.
Right.
And for anyone familiar with ancient texts, a genealogy usually signals a really good place to skim.
Oh, for sure.
You're presented with this sprawling list of, hard to pronounce names from the Bronze Age.
And your natural inclination is to just jump ahead to the actual narrative action.
Yeah, to get to the good stuff.
Yeah.
But when we look at the scholarship in the Holman and NAA materials, the reality of this specific text is actually remarkably compelling.
Which is exactly why the mission of this deep dive is to take this ancient list and strip it back to reveal its actual function.
Right.
Because it isn't just a dry family tree tracking who begot whom.
No, not at all.
We are looking at a highly sophisticated, really calculated geopolitical map of the known world at that time.
Yeah, it's a foundational document. It's attempting to explain how human beings spread out across the globe.
Drawing the borders of the ancient Near East.
It really serves as a masterclass in ancient geography and politics.
It really does.
Because, this text documents the earliest human migrations, certainly. But it also tracks the rise of aggressive tyrants, the building of monumental empires, and the deep ancient roots of historical rivalries that would shape world events for centuries to come.
It is, in every sense, the origin story of the nations.
Exactly, setting the geopolitical stage for everything that follows in the biblical text.
And to really grasp the sheer scale of what the author of Genesis is doing here, we have to look at the mathematics behind the genealogy.
The math is fascinating.
It is. The Holman Study Bible points out something spectacular about the way this list is constructed. If you sit down and actually count the specific descendants listed in this chapter,
You get exactly 70 names.
exactly 70. It breaks down meticulously. You have 14 descendants from the line of Japheth,
Right.
30 from the line of Ham, and 26 from the line of Shem.
And that specific count is entirely intentional.
It's not an accident.
No. It requires us to shift our modern perspective a bit. Today, we treat numbers in a census like accounting.
Right. We want the literal, exact head count.
Exactly. But in the mindset of the ancient Israelites, numbers often carried a really profound theological weight.
So the number 70 wasn't just a random tally of existing tribes.
Far from it, it's a multiple of 7. And 7 historically represents divine perfection or completion.
And 10.
Right. And 10 represents a kind of earthly or human totality.
So by structuring this genealogy around exactly 70 descendants, the author is communicating this concept of, well, satisfactory totality.
That's a great way to put it.
It's a symbolic, literary way of saying to you, the reader, here is the complete overarching picture of humanity spreading out to populate the earth after the flood.
Precisely. It is the ancient equivalent of mapping the whole wide world.
Yeah.
But the Holman notes emphasize that this detailed listing serves a distinct dual purpose.
Okay, let's get into those.
So the first goal is to demonstrate the fulfillment of a divine command. Earlier in the Genesis narrative, humanity is explicitly commanded to be fruitful, to multiply, and to fill the earth.
Right.
The Table of Nations acts as the documentary evidence that this command was actually carried out.
Because you see humanity branching out geographically.
Exactly. Creating families which expand into clans and eventually solidify into these vast nations.
But if the first goal is simply showing that humans populated the earth, that still doesn't explain why certain lines get so much more page space than others.
Right, the text isn't perfectly balanced.
There has to be an editorial motive behind who gets highlighted and who gets sidelined.
And that brings us to the second, and perhaps more crucial, theological purpose, which is to create a clear division.
A separation.
Yes. The text is methodically separating the lineages to highlight a specific path through history. It maps out the lines of Japheth and Ham to establish where they went and what empires they founded.
But it does that to eventually narrow the focus entirely onto the line of Shem.
Right, because it's from the line of Shem that the narrative will eventually reach Abraham.
And through Abraham the Israelites.
Exactly. The text is basically clearing away the historical brush to illuminate the chosen lineage.
It's kind of like panning a camera across a vast, sweeping landscape before sharply zooming in on the main character.
That's exactly how it functions.
And if you picture a map of the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East in your head right now, you can actually trace these three distinct migratory paths based on the study Bible maps.
Yeah, the geography is remarkably clear.
So the descendants of Japheth generally move north and west. They are recorded as settling the islands and the coastlines of the Mediterranean Sea.
Right, so we're talking about regions that correspond to modern-day Europe and Asia Minor.
Then you track the descendants of Ham, who generally migrate south and west.
And they become the foundational peoples for the continent of Africa, establishing regions like Egypt, Kush, or ancient Ethiopia, and Put, which is ancient Libya.
But crucially, a significant branch of Ham's descendants also settles right along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean.
Right in the region of Canaan.
And finally, the descendants of Shem. They primarily settle in the eastern regions of Mesopotamia.
The Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
And they stretch down throughout the sweeping expanse of the Arabian Peninsula. So you have this breathtaking tricontinental expansion mapped out through these 70 names.
It provides a sweeping aerial view of the ancient world's borders. But as with any map of human boundaries throughout history, you inevitably run into the reality of human conflict and territorial ambition.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When we look at how the text treats those descendants of Ham, the NAA Study Bible points out a glaring anomaly.
It's hard to miss once you see it.
Ham's lineage gets a disproportionate amount of attention in this chapter compared to Japheth or even Shem. Out of the 70 nations listed, 30 of them belong to Ham.
Almost half.
And the text goes into granular detail about their specific cities, their borders, and their territories.
And there is a very specific and highly strategic geopolitical reason for that extended focus.
Because of who they become.
Exactly. For the ancient Israelite reading this text, the descendants of Ham represent a literal who's who of their greatest historical adversaries.
It's the enemies list.
It really is. When you read the names in Ham's lineage, you see Mizraim, which is the ancient word for Egypt. You see the Canaanites who occupy the Promised Land.
The Philistines.
The Philistines, the early founders of Babylon, the founders of Assyria.
Right.
You are literally reading the roster of empires that would eventually enslave, attack, or conquer the people of Israel.
It's like sitting down to read your family tree, only to realize half your ancestors founded the rival sports teams you grew up hating.
That is a brilliant way to think about it.
Only in this case, the stakes are ancient warfare and centuries of subjugation.
Yeah, much higher stakes than sports.
The text is laying the historical and genealogical groundwork for the entire Old Testament's future conflicts. It's telling the reader, here is the origin story of your oppressors.
Right.
And right in the middle of this ancient enemies list, we meet a character who completely disrupts the flow of the genealogy, a man named Nimrod.
Nimrod's a fascinating figure because he breaks the established geographic pattern we just mapped out.
He doesn't follow the rules.
Not at all. Most of the names in this chapter are associated with a specific logical regional migration. For instance, Nimrod's father is Cush.
Right.
And as we noted, Cush is heavily linked to the continent of Africa, specifically ancient Ethiopia.
But Nimrod, however, doesn't stay in Africa with his ancestral clan.
He is a glaring geographic anomaly. The text explicitly tells us that Nimrod travels far from his ancestral lands. He migrates east into Mesopotamia, into the land of Shinar in Asia, to conquer and build his own empire.
He crosses established boundaries, both literally and figuratively.
Stepping out of his designated region to impose his will on another.
And the text gives him this very specific, almost legendary title. It calls Nimrod a powerful hunter before the Lord.
Right.
And to modern ears, being a powerful hunter sounds like a rugged compliment.
Yeah, you picture a survivalist providing for his community in the wilderness.
Exactly. But the study notes in the NAA Bible suggest we need to read this phrase through a completely different cultural lens.
We do. In the context of the ancient Near East, being a hunter in this sense was not about tracking deer for food.
It means something else entirely.
This phrase is heavily laden with irony. The NAA notes explain that hunter here was a well-known ancient metaphor for a tyrant or a military conqueror. If you look at ancient Assyrian or Babylonian reliefs, kings loved to depict themselves hunting lions to project dominance.
Right, showing off their power.
But Nimrod wasn't just hunting animals. He was a hunter of men. He was a subjugator.
So calling him a powerful hunter before the Lord.
It implies he was acting in direct defiance of the Lord. The aggression and the empire building of Nimrod are presented in total opposition to God's initial design.
Because God commanded humanity to spread out, to multiply, and to fill the earth collaboratively.
Right. And Nimrod's response is to do the exact opposite.
To consolidate power.
To conquer others and to build monumental urban centers of dominance. The text explicitly credits Nimrod with founding Babel, which eventually becomes Babylon.
And Nineveh?
Yes, which becomes the capital of the brutal Assyrian Empire.
Two of the most infamous cities in all of biblical history. These are cities that symbolize the ultimate human hubris, imperial brutality, and the crushing of smaller nations.
Absolutely.
Nimrod is essentially the archetype of the ancient warlord. He is the blueprint for every empire builder who tries to centralize power at the expense of human freedom.
And understanding that completely changes the weight of that little phrase about him being a hunter.
It really does.
It's a prime example of why we can't just skim these texts. Hidden inside this mundane list of names is a profound, searing critique of imperial power and tyranny.
The author is showing the reader that the impulse to dominate and subjugate others has very deep ancient roots in human history.
It establishes Babylon and Assyria not just as political enemies, but as philosophical opposites to the way humanity was meant to live.
Okay, let's unpack this and look at how the text sets up the dichotomy between these early empires and the lineage the author actually wants us to follow.
Right, the chosen line.
We've seen the rise of these sprawling, aggressive empires in the line of Ham, but the text then pivots to the line of Shem, which seems to have a much quieter, more localized legacy in this specific chapter.
The genealogy of Shem has its own unique, highly deliberate structure. The Holman notes point out that while Ham's line is detailed because of its political relevance to Israel's enemies, Shem's line is detailed because it carries the theological promise of the narrative.
And there is one specific descendant in Shem's line who gets heavily spotlighted to the exclusion of others, a man named Eber.
Yes, the NAA notes emphasize that Eber is given a tremendous amount of special attention. The text even introduces Shem initially as the father of all the children of Eber, before it even bothers to list Shem's actual immediate sons.
Which is wild.
That structural choice is crucial because Eber is the linguistic and historical root of the word Hebrew.
Because in the original language, the word is Ibri.
Exactly. By highlighting Eber so prominently, the author is essentially drawing a glowing circle around this part of the family tree and signaling to the reader, look closely here.
Because this is where the identity of the Hebrew people officially begins.
It's a moment of profound national origin embedded right in the middle of a global census.
Eber then has two sons. And the naming of one of those sons introduces what has to be one of the most debated and mysterious historical puzzle pieces in the entire chapter.
It's a huge mystery.
Eber names his son Peleg. And the text casually drops this cryptic, world-altering detail. It says, because in his days, the earth was divided.
What's fascinating here is how much historical and theological speculation surrounds that single sentence. The name Peleg literally translates to division.
Right.
But what exactly was the nature of this monumental division? The Holman Study Bible provides 4 distinct theories that scholars have debated for centuries, because the text itself leaves the mechanics of the event entirely ambiguous.
Let's give each of those theories some room to breathe, because they paint radically different pictures of what was happening in the ancient world during Peleg's lifetime. The first theory connects this division to another very famous event that happens right around the same time in the biblical timeline.
Right. The most common and widely accepted interpretation is that Peleg's name is a direct allusion to the Tower of Babel.
Which makes sense.
The narrative of Babel, which immediately follows this genealogy, resulted in the confusion of human languages. It abruptly forced humanity to scatter across the globe.
So the division of the earth in Peleg's days would refer to this profound linguistic and geographical fracturing of the human family.
It was the moment humanity was divided by speech and forced into distinct nations.
And a division of populations based on language makes logical sense within the text. But the second theory suggests a much more literal, terrifyingly physical division of the earth itself.
Yes, some scholars suggest the text is recording a devastating geological event.
Like an earthquake.
Exactly. The ancient Near East, particularly the areas around the Great Rift Valley, has a history of severe seismic volatility. This theory posits a massive earthquake or perhaps a series of tectonic shifts that literally altered the landscape.
A physical sundering of the earth.
That was so terrifying, so catastrophic to the local populations, that a father named his son as a living memorial to the event.
Naming your child after an earthquake that swallowed cities would certainly leave a permanent mark on a culture's historical memory.
It really would.
Now, the third theory, according to the Holman notes, shifts away from acts of God or nature and focuses on human engineering.
That is the canal theory. In the ancient Mesopotamian world, survival, agriculture, and prosperity depended entirely on mastering water management.
Right.
Kings would commission sprawling, complex systems of irrigation canals to divert the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These weren't small ditches.
They were massive.
They were monumental infrastructure projects requiring thousands of laborers, and they literally divided the earth into networks of arable land and strict territorial boundaries.
So some historians suggest Peleg lived during a time of an unprecedented civilization-altering canal project that redefined the map.
Exactly.
Imagining an infrastructure project so vast that it defines an entire generation is a fascinating look at ancient capabilities. But the fourth theory brings us right back to the geopolitics and the empire building we were talking about with Nimrod.
The fourth theory suggests this was a major, perhaps catastrophic political division.
Like a civil war.
As populations grew, the early tribal alliances likely fractured. This could represent a massive civil war, the splintering of an early empire, or a decisive treaty that permanently drew political borders between major factions.
So many possibilities.
The beauty of the ancient text, and perhaps the primary frustration for modern historians looking for hard facts, is that it leaves us with this tantalizing mystery.
It gives us just enough detail to know something monumental happened to human civilization, but leaves the exact mechanics open to our interpretation. So what does this all mean? We've covered a lot of historical and literary ground today.
I really have.
We've talked about the numerology of 70 nations, the tracking of global migratory paths across 3 continents, the rise of an ancient warlord hunting for power, and a mysterious global division that could have been anything from a new language to a tectonic fracture.
It's a lot to take in.
For you listening right now, living thousands of years after these events, navigating your own modern life, why does a document like the Table of Nations actually matter?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this text is a profound reminder that humanity has always, fundamentally, sought to understand its interconnectedness.
We still do this today.
We mail off DNA tests to find our ethnic percentages. We build sprawling family trees online. We study modern migration patterns to understand shifting demographics.
We have an innate driving need to know where we came from, who our ancestors were, and how we relate to the people living across the border from us.
We're constantly searching for our collective origin story.
We are, and the authors of Genesis 10 were doing exactly that, just on a macro level for the ancient world.
They are showing us that ancient people didn't view history as a series of random, chaotic, disconnected events. They saw a grand, unfolding narrative,
They understood that decisions made by a single patriarch could ripple through centuries.
turning small families into regional clans and eventually turning those clans into towering nations.
It also serves as a potent warning about human ambition. When we look at figures like Nimrod, the hunter of men, the text feels incredibly relevant to modern history.
It serves as a timeless critique of the consequences of empire building. It reminds the reader that whenever humanity tries to centralize power, subjugate others, and dominate the landscape,
Whether it's building a towering ziggurat in ancient Babylon or launching an unprovoked war of territorial conquest today,
it fundamentally disrupts the intended order of human flourishing. It creates systems of oppression that can scar the geopolitical landscape for generations.
it's a cycle.
The modern world we navigate today, the borders we argue over, the international alliances, the deep-seated rivalries, they are really just the latest chapter of a very, very old story of human movement, ambition, and division.
It is remarkably humbling to realize that the international headlines we read on our phones today are echoing themes of territory and power that were written down on parchment thousands of years ago.
We are all just participating in this continuous sprawling narrative of migration and civilization. And this raises an important question, and it's something really profound to mull over as we wrap up our analysis today.
Let's hear it.
The NAA Study Bible points out a crucial nuance about how to read ancient genealogies. It notes that an ancestor named in a text like this might not just represent a single biological individual.
Right.
In ancient literature, a single name often became the personification of an entire clan or tribe migrating and evolving over centuries. The individual's name becomes a historical shorthand for a whole people group's legacy.
The name essentially carries the collective weight and reputation of thousands of people over hundreds of years.
Exactly. So think about this as you go about your week. If historians thousands of years from now were to sit down and write a new table of nations for our modern world,
If they tried to summarize our entire civilization's movements, our modern borders, our geopolitical conflicts, and our greatest achievements into a single genealogy,
what single names would they use? What specific characteristics, what ambitions or actions would become the permanent historical shorthand for who we were and what we built?
that is a staggering thought to leave on. Are we building systems of division and empire, or are we fulfilling a better, more collaborative purpose? It really forces you to evaluate the kind of history we're actively writing right now in our own generation. Thank you for taking this incredible journey through the ancient geopolitical landscape with us today. God bless all the listeners.